Hey everybody, what's going on? So this is going to be the second video on the second Azure Attack Lab. The first video of this lab was the shorter version where we went through the commands and the attack path and the kill chain, and we managed to get the super secret file at the end of the lab. In this video, we're going to be focusing more on how the services were built, how the misconfigurations were introduced. So instead of focusing on the tradecraft of the tools and tricks and the commands, we're going to be focusing more on the, let's call it the architecture side of things. In the original video, the lab as it was presented uses Terraform to build up everything from scratch. But in this video, I don't want to be using Terraform. I want you to see how these things are built, how these are created. I'm not gonna go through a big introduction of what this lab is all about. We've already covered this in the previous video. So what I'll do is I'll just link the previous video in the description. If you are not too familiar with what's going on, please make sure that you watch the shorter version of this video, because this one, it looks like it's gonna be a bit long. So I don't wanna spend too much time on unnecessary things that we've covered in a previous video. So without any further ado, let's dive straight in. Now, we do have a user called KT, and this is the compromised user. This is our foothold into the Azure account or the Azure portal. And we don't have much information about KT. All we know that we have compromised this user. So obviously I've created or I've pre-created this user. We've seen how we do this, and it's not really something too difficult. You just click on the new user and you create the KT user. That's about it. From here on, we're going to start giving KT permissions to certain resources. So we're going to create these resources and we're going to give KT permissions over these resources from the build sort of point of view. And then I'm gonna sort of switch back very quickly to the attack point of view and show you why do we see what the attacker sees. All right, so let's carry on. Now that we have the user created, let's start creating some of the resources that we're going to be compromising. And the first thing that we would normally do is create a resource group. This is necessary to creating any resource. So I'm gonna go ahead and create a resource group that I'm going to call engineering. Once that resource group is created, I can now start adding resources. And the very first resource that I'm going to add is going to be a storage account. We're going to be using this storage account to create storage services that belong into this storage account. So later on within the storage account, I will be creating a blob storage and a file storage where our secret files are going to be stored. So here's me creating the storage account, and you can see that I am using the same resource group. We're gonna give it a name of data mining 01, which is identical to the previous lab. And from here on, that's about it. So creating this storage account is pretty straightforward. Now that the deployment is complete, I can go to the storage account and I can start creating data storage services. So we're gonna start with the containers. And I'm going to create a private container. So notice here that I'm selecting private, no anonymous access. That should be a private container that nobody has access to unless me as the admin specify who is going to get access to. And the name of this container is going to be investment. And I'm going to be uploading a file to this container. Now, this is a secret file, which is basically a secret or private SSH key that is going to give us access to a VM later on. So the assumption here is that KT needs access to a certain VM, to a Linux box. And as the admin, I've created the storage container and I've uploaded the SSH key so that KT can later download it and use it. So I'm basically sharing this SSH key with KT. So that's the first thing that I'm creating. The second thing, which will come to a lot later during this video, this is our super secret key. And that's going to be a file share. So this is different than containers. And I'm just gonna call it engineering data, identical to the lab as well. And in this file share, I'm going to be uploading a basic text file. And this text file is going to be called super secret file. It just has some random text that says congratulations, yada yada. And the idea is that this file is not accessible by anybody. It's only accessible by very specific IDs, as we're going to be seeing later. But since I'm already in the storage account, I'm gonna go ahead and set it up straight away. So now that this is done, let me switch back to KT. So now I'm in the KT account. I'm not in the admin account. So please make sure that you are aware of this. I'm in the KT account. And if I go and see what kind of resources do I have access to, you'll notice that I don't have access to anything. Nothing yet. Why? Because I still don't have permission to access anything. So let me switch back and go to the admin account. So now I'm back in the admin account and I'm going to give KT some permissions. The first permissions are in the storage account. So notice I'm back to the data mining 01 storage account. And I'm going to go to access control and I'm going to start adding some role assignments to KT. Now KT here will have a reader access, which means she can view all the resources on the storage account but cannot make any changes. And of course I have to select the user ID for KT. Once that is done, I'm going to also add another role. And this time I'm going to give KT the storage blob data reader. And this is because I want KT to be able to read the data from the blob or from the container. I want her to be able to download the secret key so she can use it later on to log into the VM. So we're gonna go ahead and select the KT user again, and here we are. So this is our first set of permissions or role assignments complete. So now if I go back to KT, and that might take a minute or two, so be a little bit patient if it doesn't happen immediately. But if I go back to KT and refresh, you will see, by the way, if the refresh doesn't work and if you waited a couple minutes, it still doesn't work, log out, log back in, it should be fine. But in any case, you notice here that now KT has access to the storage account, or some kind of access at least. If I click on it, notice that she can see the containers, the investment, and the secret. And with that, KT is now able to download the secret. And this is basically exactly what is intended. The admin wanted KT to be able to download this file so she can later use it to log into the Linux VM. We haven't created the Linux VM yet, we will do that. But notice that if KT goes to the file shares, she doesn't have access. The access is denied. And again, this is intended. This file share is super secret. Nobody should have access to it except very specific IDs. So this is exactly what we want. Now KT can get on with her job, can download the secret file, can use it, but cannot access the super secret file share. Great. So let's go back to the admin and let's create more resources. Now KT, as I've mentioned, will be accessing a VM. And I don't want KT to have access to all the resources of the VM or all the services of the VM. I want to be very specific about this. And what I really like about this lab is that it is set up in a fairly quote-unquote secure way. So it is done right. But unfortunately, once you compromise the KT ID, you can follow a certain path, as we're going to be seeing, to get access to the super secret file. So now as an admin, instead of giving KT access to the entire VM that I'm going to create, I'm just going to give her access to specific things that she needs to get the job done. For example, KT is going to need the public IP address of the VM so she can SSH to it. So I'm going to go ahead as the admin and create a public IP address. And I'm going to call it Linux VM public IP. From here on, it is pretty straightforward. Just select the resource group and validate and then deploy. So now I have a public IP, but I still want to give KT access to it. So I'm going to go to the access control and I'm going to give KT the reader access to it. That's all she needs. She just needs to read what the public IP address is. Great. Now that the role is assigned, I still need to do one more thing. I need to create a network security group. And the network security group, basically, think of it as part of it is firewall rules that will control inbound and outbound traffic from the virtual machine. And KT will need to control this because she needs to SSH into the machine. So she needs to tell this group, the network security group, that this is my IP as KT, and this is the port that I need to SSH into. And if Katie's IP changes, she needs to go back and change the rules, the inbound traffic rules. And as an admin, I don't want to be doing that every time Katie's IP changes. So she should have the ability to do that, right? So I'm gonna go ahead and create the network security group. And again, I'm just using the same resource group here. Let's give it a name. We'll call it Linux VM NSG for network security group. And that's about it. Pretty straightforward. Of course, we don't want to forget giving Katie access. So we're gonna go to access control and give Katie the owner access this time, because I want Katie to have full access. As the admin, I want Katie to take care of this, to manage this. I don't want to be involved in that every time Katie's IP address changes. So up until now, this seems pretty typical. Actually, better than typical. It sounds pretty safe and secure. We're creating resources that are exactly what is necessary for Katie to do her job. We're giving Katie exactly the permissions that are needed to do her job. Nothing more, nothing less. Maybe we could have been a little bit more particular with the permissions, but you know what? This is what is allowing us to abuse these resources and to follow the kill chain or the attack path. Now that is done, let me go back to Katie and see what Katie sees. So I'm switching back to Katie and I'm going to refresh the resources, and immediately I can see that the Linux public IP is now apparent in my resources. Let me try to refresh again a couple times. And here we go. Now we can also see the NSG, the network security group. Fantastic. This is the beginning of the setup and the beginning of the kill chain. So in the previous video, we went through the details of how we do that. In this video, I'm gonna run you through it very quickly. I'm not gonna go and spend too many details explaining what these commands are doing, because we've already explained that. So basically here, I am logged in as Katie. Katie is the compromised user. And I'm going to take a look at what are the role assignments for Katie. We can see this is exactly what we have set up in the portal as the admin. And I can now list the storage account details. I can see what is in the containers. And I can go ahead and download the secret file. And if I take a look at the secret file or the secret key, it looks like it's a SSH key. Great. So let me go back to my portal. I'm back into the admin account or the admin portal. And now I want to create the virtual machine that Katie is going to be accessing. So Katie will have access to a Linux VM. So I'm going to go into virtual machines and I'm going to start creating the Linux VM. Now, usually it's pretty straightforward. If you are creating a virtual machine for the first time, it's nothing really fancy. But in this instance, we're going to be making some minor tweaks because we have a particular public IP, we have a particular SSH key, we have a particular NSG that we want to be using. So it's not going to be just next, right? But the first thing, obviously, is we want to create the resource group, or select the resource group that we want to use. We're going to give the Linux VM its name, and we are going to select the image. From here on, I'm not changing much. Just be careful with the sizing. I have selected a standard B2S size, which is fairly cheap. And now we get to the administrator's account. You can go with either SSH key or password. So if you're not too comfortable with creating and using SSH keys, you still want to follow along with the lab, just use a password. That will allow you to log into the VM. But here what I'm using is the public private key that I've already pre-created before this video. And I am specifying that the username is going to be Azure user. You can select whatever you want. And I'm using the public key that I have pre-created. Now notice here that by default, the public inbound port of 22 is open. And that's going to be open for everybody. So not just for Katie's IP. This is the default behavior. And I don't want that. I want this to be more secure. So I'm going to select none. Now, the next thing that we want to do is jump into networking. So we'll skip over disks. We're not going to change anything, get to the networking section. And this is where I want to select the NSG that I created and the public IPs that I created. I don't want a randomly assigned public IP, and I don't want a default NSG. So over here, we're going to go into the public IP and select the one that we have created. This is the one that Katie has reader permissions over. And now to select the network security group, I'm going to go into advanced and select the NSG that we have created as well as the admin. So what are we doing here? We are assigning the public IP that we've created, but that Katie has access to this VM. Similarly, we are assigning the NSG that we as the admin created, but that Katie also has access to. We're assigning this NSG to this VM. So in essence, plus of course, don't forget the SSH key. So in essence, what we're doing is we're creating this Ubuntu Linux VM, and instead of giving full access to the VM to Katie, what we're doing is we're telling Katie that this is what you need to access the VM. You need the public IP, you need the NSG, and you need the private key, and we've given you access to this, so go and use it to be able to access the VM. And from here on, I can go to review and create, and once this passes, I can start deploying the machine. Once the deployment is complete, there is one more step that I want to do, and this is needed for later on, and that's going to be assigning a system identity. So I'm going to go into identities, and I'm going to switch this into on to have a system assigned identity for this VM. So we talked about what managed identities are in previous videos. Basically, in a nutshell, the easiest way to think about it, that's not 100% technically correct, but that's the easiest way to think about it. Think of it as a service account for this Linux VM. So the VM needs to access certain resources, and for the VM to be able to access these resources, it needs an account, it needs an ID that I have to assign permissions to, and this is what this ID is. So I have just created an ID for this VM. Later on, I'm going to be giving this ID certain permissions. Alright, now that we are in the VMs services, let's go ahead and create the other VM as well that we're going to be needing. And we're going to be needing a Windows VM. So again, pretty much same procedure. This one is going to be a little bit easier though. We're gonna go into new and select the resource group, give it a name. I'm naming it Windows VM. And instead of the image being Ubuntu, of course, I'm gonna go with Windows. The rest is pretty much going to be standard. So I'm just gonna go with a username, Azure user. You could select whatever you want. Pick a password. And here, I also don't want to have any public inbound ports open. Usually by default, Windows will have RDP open and exposed to the public. I don't want that. I actually don't want even this VM to have a public IP. But first, let me block all access. And then again, I'm gonna skip to networking. And over here, I am going to select that I don't want any public IPs. So this VM is not going to be accessible from the internet. It will only be accessible from the same subnet wherever I have some other computers or other VMs lying around. And that's about it. So I'm gonna go ahead and validate this. And of course the validation failed because I keep forgetting this every single time I create a Windows VM. I know exactly what I forgot. Let me go back. Here we go. And all right, now the validation is passed and the deployment is on way. So now let's go back to the attacker's view and see what the attacker sees. So remember, we're logged in as Katie, and we've seen by looking at Katie's role assignments that she has access to a container. We've already downloaded the file. She also has access to an NSG. So we're going to take a look at this NSG, and that's going to show us that there is no rules. That just returns no results, it's empty. But we know that we own this NSG. We have full access over it, so we can change it. Because we have an SSH key, we're going to open up port 22. And this is what the rule is doing. So we're creating a new rule here, and this new rule says open port 22 to the IP address of Katie. And if I go back to the portal now and refresh, you're going to see the new rule has been created. The last missing component is the public IP address. Now you can see it from the portal, of course, but from the command line, this is what it looks like. So when I run this command, I have the public IP address. So now I have all the components that I need to SSH into the Linux VM. I have the private SSH key, I have the public IP, and I have opened access to port 22. So now I can SSH into the Ubuntu box. So let's just do that. I'm going to switch into another VM, and I've already copied the private key, of course, to this VM, and I'm just going to use SSH with the key and the Azure user to log into the VM. And here we are. I'm logged in. Fantastic. Now, if you remember, with this VM, we also have a managed identity. When we went to the identity section and we switched it to on, this is where we assigned a managed identity to the Linux VM. And because it's an identity, that means we can log in as this identity. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to log in as the identity. But it tells me that the Azure client is not found. So I'm going to go ahead and install this. I'll skip over this fairly quickly because this is not a course on Linux commands. And now let's try and log in as the identity. But we get an error, and it says that there is no access configured for this identity. So maybe we can try allow no subscriptions. So let's try that. That logs in, but if we try to list anything or look at the roles, we're going to see that we don't have any access. This is because I forgot to give access to the identity. It was created, but I didn't assign any permissions to it yet. So let me clear this up first, make sure that there is no logins available, and let's go back to the admin. So first thing I want to do is I want to go to the Windows VM, not the Linux. I'm going to the Windows VM. You will see why in a moment. And I'm going to go to Access Control. And I'm going to select the access of contributor. So the contributor role pretty much gives you full access to manage the resource, with the exception of allowing you to assign other other roles to the resource. What that means basically is I'm allowing somebody pretty much full access to the Windows VM. So who's going to have full control over this Windows VM or full access over this Windows VM? It's going to be our Linux managed identity. I hope you got that. So I have a Windows VM. I'm giving somebody full access over this VM. Who's that somebody? This is my Linux managed identity. And this is what I'm selecting here. I'm selecting managed identity, and I'm going to go ahead and select the Linux VM managed identity. So now effectively, if I'm able to compromise the Linux managed identity or log in as the Linux managed identity, I'm going to have full access over what? Over the Windows VM. Okay, great, but what does that allow me to do? So if I now have access to the Windows VM, what else can I do? That takes us back to the kill chain. So let's set this up. I'm going to go to the Windows VM, and the Windows VM also has a managed identity. So I'm going to switch this on. And the managed identity of the Windows VM will have access to what? Think about it for a second. What was the last objective that we needed? The Windows managed identity VM is going to have full access to the super secret file. And what is the super secret file? It's in the storage account. So I'm going to go to the storage account, go to the role assignments, and I'm going to go with the storage account contributor, which will give full access to the storage account data. And in this instance, I'm going to select the Windows VM managed identity. So in effect, what's happening now is from my Linux box, if I have access to the Linux managed identity, the Linux managed identity has access to the Windows VM. if I have access to the Windows VM, the Windows VM has access to the storage account where I have the super secret file. And this is what we're going to be doing in the next few steps. So from this Linux VM, I'm going to log in as the identity now. And once I look at the role assignments, I can see that the managed identity of the Linux VM has contributor right over the Windows VM virtual machine. Now I need a little bit more information to be able to log in to the Windows VM, and this is basically what we've done in the previous video. So I'm gonna walk through this fairly quickly because it was explained in a lot of details in the previous video. What I'm doing right now is I'm running some commands on the VM to add myself as an administrator user. So I'm adding the user and I'm assigning the user to the local administrators group. And the other thing that is still missing is the IP address of the VM, because remember, this VM does not have a public IP and it does not have public RDP exposed. So I'm gonna have to do this internally from within the same subnet. So here we go. I got the IP address and that's about it. So from now on, it's basically just technical commands. I'm just doing some port forwarding where I'm forwarding the RDP of the Windows VM locally to my Linux box, and I'm using the RDP to log into the Windows VM. Now that I'm on the Windows VM, what's going to be my next step? I want to log in as the managed identity of the Windows VM. So let me go ahead and open PowerShell. Now you are able to log in as the Windows VM managed identity, system assigned managed identity. And remember, what kind of permissions does this VM has? If we look at the permissions, it has a storage account contributor permission, which basically means it has full access to the storage account data. And from here on, what that allows me to do is to list the file share and to go ahead and download the file share. And this is what's happening in the next few commands. So with that, we reach the end of this video. Let's recap what we have done. We've built the entire setup from scratch without using the Terraform script. We created these services one by one. We started with KT, which has access to a storage account. In that storage account, there is a container with an SSH key. The SSH key allows access to a Linux VM. However, with the Linux VM, she can't see all the resources of that Linux VM. All she can access is the public IP and the NSG, which is the exact enough information that she needs to access the or SSH into the Linux VM. So we go ahead and create an inbound rule allowing for SSH access. We grab the public IP and we log into the Linux VM. The Linux VM has a managed identity, and that managed identity has access to a Windows VM. So we log in as the managed identity once we are on the Linux box. We list the roles of the Linux VM and we see that we have access to a Windows VM. So we use that to RDP into that Windows VM. Once we are on the Windows VM, we also look at the managed identity role and we see that the Windows VM also has a managed identity assigned that has a role that allows it to fully read all the data in the storage account. And we use that or abuse that to go and access the file share and thus are able to access the super secret key. And that's about it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned a thing or two, and I will see you soon in another video.